All right. So the subject is language. Language is an important part of geographical studies. Uh, it's an important part of culture because it's an important part of our identity, how we express ourselves and how we receive and process information in different languages. Um, Now, language, of course, is defined as an organizational system of speech people use that enables an exchange of ideas, traditions, and values. Now, usually of speech. Can you communicate by um, sign language? Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, the earliest languages known are believed to have been sign languages. The organized system of speech or words that people use to exchange ideas, traditions, and values. It's estimated there are about 6,000 to 7,000 different languages in use in the world today. All languages. Now, some languages are extinct. That is, a tribe dwindles down to nothing, and the language they use dies with it. You see this a lot in a lot of more isolated remote areas like the Amazon, New Guinea, portions of Africa, just generations. This language took maybe only about a couple hundred people at the most when it, at its height. Just probably have this one guy left or one woman left who had been a member of this tribe, and there's the last one who knows the language, and the language dies with them. Now, it's estimated that a third of all languages spoken today are from Africa. About another third, about 2,200, being used in Asia. And maybe about 1,000 languages spoken in the Americas. And the most commonly spoken languages in the Americas, though, are not native to the Americas. It's colonization. But we think of the four primary languages spoken in North and South America: English, spoken in the United States and Canada and some Caribbean islands; French, spoken in portions of Canada; Spanish across Latin America; and Portuguese across most of Brazil. In Europe, there are only about maybe 230 languages and dialects spoken. They're spoken over a fairly compact area, so it seems like they're. But about half the world speaks any one of about 8 languages as a native language. That is the language they learned first in their lives. And at least half the world population regularly use or have a competency in at least 4 of these languages. 29 languages are spoken by more than 40 million people, and 11 languages by more than 100 million people. So, what is the most commonly spoken language in the world? Mandarin Chinese. Now, second language, that's a language you learn after you learn your first language, from when you're born, basically. Sometimes people may grow up learning a couple different languages at the same time. But again, the most popular or most commonly spoken is Mandarin. More than 1.07 billion people followed by English. English is the second most commonly spoken language in the world. 600 million speakers. And this is both the first and second language. Now, the thing about Mandarin Chinese, so if you look here on page 160, 161, is it's fairly geographically isolated. It's spoken mostly just in China. But English is spoken all over the world. And again, there are a couple of different reasons for that. It's not geographically isolated. Part of that is because of American business, American culture being spread all over the world, American literature. And with the British Empire, they had colonies in all corners of the earth. So there are a lot of countries that have, particularly there's the Pacific and Africa and Asia and elsewhere, where they may have several official languages. That is, the language which all the correspondence for their government is done, which is maybe a local native language and English. Even though the armies and the bureaucrats may leave an area, but the cultural influences often stay behind. Third most commonly spoken language is Hindi. Basically spoken in India. Indian people speak these. Or Spanish. About 450 million speakers. And spoken in Spain, obviously, but also the former Spanish colonies, making up Latin America, everything from Mexico down to Argentina. Official language. The United States doesn't actually have an official language. But most people here do speak English. But there are some people who live here their whole lives and don't. There's several little pockets of areas where we speak different languages. You actually see foreign language newspapers made from designed for different members of the different immigrant communities. German, Vietnamese, Danish, Dutch, Chinese, and so forth. But that's the fourth most commonly. Spanish is the fourth most commonly spoken language in the world. And English and Spanish are the two most commonly spoken languages in the United States. After that, Russia. About 267 million speakers. And in Russia and areas around Russia, parts that had been part of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. Another language commonly spoken in India, Bengali. $230 million speakers. Followed by Portuguese, spoken in Portugal and in Brazil. And just about 200 million speakers. Malay Indonesian, Malaysia and Indonesia. About 180 million speakers. Then Japanese. 135 million speakers. But again, think about Japanese again, it's geographically isolated. It's spoken mostly in Japan and the home islands. And the 10th most commonly spoken language in the world, French. 132 million speakers. Again, widely spoken across areas of Africa because of French colonial influence. French is commonly chosen as a spoken second language for people to speak because it is so widely distributed geographically. You find a lot of native French speakers in portions of Africa, France, Canada. So forth. Now, linguists, people who study language, often group languages together into what's called language family. Group of languages thought to have come from a common earlier tongue. It started out with a common language, and as people spread it out over the world, over an area, the language evolved. You can understand, languages are always changing. They're always growing, they're always evolving. Because one generation after another, they sometimes pick up different expressions, different ways of saying things, commonly related to common cultural experiences. Like I said, just look at old TV shows. Look at the slang expressions they used in the 50s versus the 70s versus what they use today. Very subtle difference in language. Look at changes in writing style. Say from say Shakespearean English to Mark Twain in the 19th century to what people speak today. But the largest language family is the Indo-European language group. Now these languages spoken by about half the people in the world. And again, from the map here in the book, you can see how widely spread it is, particularly across Asia, parts of Asia, and the Americas. And the language spread out as the people moved out. But as people move out and around the world, what happens is accents change. You're in a different area, so you have different wildlife, fauna, and so you need new words to describe these new animals, new plants. And of course, since they're isolated, often they have different cultural experiences over time, and so these expressions become part of the language. But there are certain root words that kind of stay in common. Now, Indo-European languages believed to emerge from a Proto-Indo-European language sometime about 5,000 years ago. It's evolved where it is now. About 2500 BC, societies have broken up into numerous different groups, and languages evolved from there. Now, there are several different subfamilies of the Indo-European language. And those, the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Baltic languages, Celtic, Greek, and Indo-Uranian. Say, for example, in areas like Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan, what they speak is usually Persian or Farsi. They don't speak Arabic as they do in the western parts of the Arab world, the Muslim world. But yeah, Romance languages. This is generally Southern and Western Europe. Germanic languages, Northern and Central Europe. Slavic, Southeastern Europe. Baltic, Baltic Sea area. Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. Celtic, the native languages of the British Isles before the Greek, obviously Greece. And Indo-Uranian, Asia. A group starting around Eastern Europe, the Caucasus Mountains, moving out and around. Another common, but of these Indo-European languages, the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, are the most commonly spoken. But there is another group here, commonly used, Bantu languages, Bantu family. Mostly a group of languages spoken in Central and Southern Africa. And there are about 300 languages used here. The areas where the most commonly spoken, where they're not commonly spoken, that's often referred to by linguists as the Bantu line. It's often a cultural marker between Central and Southern Africa versus the Arab-dominated Saharan Africa. And Arabic, even though it tends to use a derivation of the Old Greek and Phoenician alphabets, it's a very different language, part of the Afro-Asiatic group. You also hear the term standard language being used. Now, linguists, they'll subdivide languages in all sorts of different ways. This is the accepted use of a language. For example, there's proper English, or they may call it the King's English. There are also just a lot of slang usage. You also have the use of what they call a dialect. This is the oral spread of social, professional, or other subdivisions of a general group. Basically, close to the standard language, but there are no significant differences. Just basically certain words, phrases, expressions. The thing about a dialect, though, is the sentence structure is generally the same. As we see here on our handout here on comparative languages, it's not just the words that matter, but it's the order in which you use them. Syntax, sentence structure. A colloquial language. This is a less formal language spoken most commonly. In full and proper sentences, observations of certain social niceties and so forth, but a few slang expressions thrown in, a few idioms and metaphors. Social dialects. Yes, there's actually distinct differences in language based on social class. Remember this movie I saw years ago was about a group of a working class couple in Scotland. The accents were so thick and heavy, and they're using so many slang expressions that they actually had to use subtitles in an English language movie to an English language audience. I said, yes, there are people of different social classes because they're running around different circles, have different concerns. They will use different words and use them in different ways. For example, in English, the use of a double negative, ain't got no or don't have no or something like that, that's improper. But as a social dialect, it's commonly used in rural areas and lower working class areas. That's not something you'd ever be seeing among the upper classes. Another example here, the King's English. Is that as prim and proper English being used by the upper classes in England. And the dialect commonly used in England among the working classes called Cockney. It is in many ways a social dialect. It uses a lot of expressions that wouldn't be used in formal company. I think it's right or wrong. I'm just saying people speak differently for different situations. And of course, cultural experiences, but also diet, also accent can really affect how people use a language. Now, here in the American South, we all speak with a drawl. It's a heavily exaggerated, drawn out form of it, drawn out use of syllables. It's basically how here in the South, every word has at least two syllables, just because of the drawl we use. But you go to some place like Ohio, a native Ohioan has very little accent at all. In eastern Canada, they have very little accent at all. And so they're very neutral for their emphases and length of time they used to use a draw out a syllable. Like I said, eastern Canada is like Ontario, even portions of Quebec. So if you ever notice a Canadian newscaster talking, they usually have very little of an accent. In the Midwest, people don't speak as much of a drawl, but they have a very distinct twang to the language. Next, say differences between social groups, not just where you are, but sometimes who you are. You ever heard the expression honky? It's a slang expression. It really originated in African American community in the 1930s and 40s. To describe how whites tend to have a very nasal tone to the words they use. They're honky. Or especially here in the South, English does not have a verb for the second person plural pronoun. Most languages, they'll have a pronoun for you, plural. You, several people, you. But in English, it's just simply you singular and you plural. What do we do in the South? We invented y'all. Solve the language problem by creating a whole new program. Y'all. You all. Understand, many dialects can coexist in the same space. Um, and people can often speak it in several speak it and switch back and forth all the time without even realizing it. Sometimes it's referred to as, sometimes derisively, as code switching, but people use the language they need to the audience they're using for the purpose they're using. For example, you'd never expect Queen Elizabeth to start delivering a speech for Parliament, start dropping a bunch of F-bombs. Just wouldn't be proper. Because the situation, I said that our culture just simply would not find that acceptable. But Queen Elizabeth just out on the street, just talking to people, working class, just expressing her emotions. Someplace where she's not really she's not on the spot. She's relaxed, able to be herself. Yeah, she can sit there and cuss the whole day, all day long. Use a lot of slang expressions if she couldn't use that parliamentary speech, because dialects and social dialects, they exist in the same space. We adjust compared to who we're talking to. For example, you will generally talk to your professors in a different way than you'll talk to your friends and family. Like say, authority figures, you generally speak to them in a different way, generally a little bit more formal. Friends, guys you're just hanging out with, siblings, linguistically, you just kind of let it all hang out. Not everybody's like that, but most people are. So it brings us the idea of linguistic geography. Study of the character of spatial patterns of geography. Geographical is regional dialects, just how people are talking, how people are using expressions. Example, go to Ireland. Most people watching movies, they think they know how Irishmen speak, but they really don't speak that way. But there's a difference in dialect and difference in accent compared to whether you're in the city or you're in the countryside. And a lot of people in the countryside, they still speak Gaelic. Again, one of those native languages to the British Isles, the Celtic language group. Celtic, also pronounced Celtic, depending on who you ask. But go to, say, California. They speak with a drawl, but not with a twang. Except the words tend to be kind of exaggerated. But you'll see these in different areas and so forth. Southern Louisiana is really interesting for dialects because the people who originally settled there, original Europeans that settled there, they spoke not just French, but Cajun French, which is actually a dialect of French. Because the original Cajuns, they were from a part of France where it was kind of isolated, kind of rural, and so they kind of basically developed their own kind of dialect. So the syntax is very similar to French, but there are some significant differences. Particularly once the language kind of grew and developed in southern Louisiana, kind of took on extended a life of its own, to the point where a native French speaker and a Cajun French speaker, they sometimes have trouble understanding each other. But even within southern Louisiana, because it's so isolated, because of all the marshes and areas, it's kind of hard to get from one area to the other. There are a lot of very distinct accents based on where you're at and what social class you grew up in. You go south of New Orleans out into the swamp areas, they speak with almost kind of a very distinctive accent. Not like a southern accent at all, but sounds more like a Brooklyn accent. Um, but some languages are so close together that you can actually understand them really well. For example, Norwegian versus Danish. Those are two very distinct languages, but they're so close to each other that if a Dane's talking to a Norwegian, they didn't speak a lick of each other's language. They could at least have a conversation with each other. They could understand what the other one's trying to say. Which brings us to our sheet on comparative languages. Now, the thing about the English language is it's a mix of a whole bunch of different languages. About a half dozen different languages kind of crammed into one. That's why it's generally why people say it's so hard to learn English when your native language is a different language, because there are so many exceptions to the rule. I mean, think of spelling in English. How weird it is to spell words in English. Or how many exceptions you have to rules of grammar and so forth. One thing about the English language is you have a lot of people moving in and out of the area. Whereas you have the Celtic tribes living there, then the Romans come in, and those languages, Latin and Celtic, kind of mix together a little bit. But then after the Romans abandoned Britain, you still have a little bit of those languages there, but then the Anglo-Saxons come in, and they bring in a Germanic language. In fact, for a while in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century, it was language being spoken across most of England was basically Old Danish. What the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes did, though, was they brought in a whole new language and a whole new language pattern, which made it a Germanic language. But England had so many influences from the French, from Latin writers and Latin speakers, the native Celts, from the Germans, the Danes, even from the Spanish. They have this whole mix, this grab bag of different words. They're being made into one language, which actually gave English a real kind of flexibility. We can make up an expression and immediately move into all the different parts of speech. It could be, give you one slang word, and we can immediately make it into a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, a preposition, which is very helpful because the pace of changing technology is forcing us to start bringing in new words to describe all the equipment we use and all the scientific content we use. And because English is so widely spoken in so many different parts of the world, that international airline pilots are required to speak English. By treaty, that is the standard language used for international pilots. So, you're traveling from one country to another, everybody can speak has one language they all understand. So you can make sure that these pilots know what they can understand each other, and they can understand directions for the air traffic tower. So even some little flight from, say, China to Malaysia, off the airplane, nobody speaks a lick of English. On the airplane, they are speaking English in the cockpit, in the air traffic control tower, because they need to be able to understand each other. Latin used to have that same effect. In Europe, it was basically the language of academics. How could they communicate scientific ideas and concepts and philosophical concepts to each other? They wrote Latin back and forth to each other. 20th century were considered to be educated unless you spoke Latin, but it's really kind of fallen by the wayside. English has kind of supplanted that. But yes, a lot of common words. For example, mother. It's a common language, common word in every language because everybody has a mother. In Hindi, it would be mother. Mother in English. Mater in Latin. Madre, Spanish. More in Danish. You understand, with Danish, the people call glottal stop. Kind of skip in the words. Mother. More. Mother in German. Notice they all have languages from all over the world, but they have this common root with a word like mother. They all kind of sound alike. Well, I started that sound. Because generally with infants, that's the first verbal sound they can use, the sound. This is what is called in linguistics cognate. It is different words that sound like another word in another language, where you can see the relationship. But there's a catch here. It's also what linguists call a false cognates also. Words that sound like it could be used in another language, but isn't related at all. But you can see with these different words here, kind of how English becomes a Germanic language. Again, sentence structure and so forth. And the Romance languages, called that because of the Romans. Those languages evolved from Latin. That includes modern Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. Very specific style, but basically, among other things, how you use different words to conjugate a verb. You don't necessarily do that with Germanic languages. Germanic language is all very specific subject, verb, in common sentences. Let's say common days of the week. Sunday in English. Dominican and Latin will be Domingo in Spanish. Again, distinct difference between the Romance languages and the Germanic languages. But Danish, it's Sunday. German, Sonntag. Notice how those sound closer to each other. Monday, Lune, Lunes, Montag, Montag. Or Tuesday, Martis, Martes in the Latin and Spanish. Tuesday in Danish. Dienstag in German. Or Wednesday, Mercredi in Latin. Miércoles in Spanish. Wednesday in Danish. You can see how those words sound closer together. It sounds more like English than it does Spanish. Mittwoch, Sturmwort. You can kind of tell, even from the cognate here, Mittwoch, midweek. For numbers, Germanic languages, we tend to use our numbers, the words we use for them are different from in the Romance languages. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's in Spanish. Versus Danish. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It doesn't quite sound like English, but again, it's not English. We try in German. 1, 2, 3. Sounds very close to 3. 4, 5, 6, 7. Sounds very close to 7. 8, 9. for 9. Zin for 10. Zin. Colors. Azul is blue in Spanish. Verde is green. Blanco is yellow, white. Amarillo, yellow. Rojo, red. Dorado, purple. Essay versus German. Blau for blue. Grün for green. Weiß for white. Weiß and white, as they should sound very close together. Gelb for yellow. Rot for red. Violet for purple. Versus Bob in Danish. Gloon for green. Vide for white. Notice how close that sounds. Gul for yellow. Wood for red. Lila for purple. Again, you notice how close these languages sound. Just enough where if you can pronounce them and speak them out loud, you can kind of hear the relationship. You can kind of see it a little bit. But it's just different enough where they're distinct different languages, each with their own separate rules for how to speak and how to use it properly. Just as the English language has changed dramatically in the last 400 or 500 years, I think of the King James Version of the Bible versus what we have you can speak today, languages change. It's going to change with how people want to speak and how they want to express themselves. While there are certain slang phrases and expressions that will come in and out of use, it's commonly used today, maybe not used at all in another 10 years. The language itself will keep changing. As the English language we'll be reading in 200 years, it will be different from what we use in the 21st century. But it'll still be close enough we can understand what it is, what they're saying. So I also have the term lingua franca. It's the established language used by people living in a particular area. A variation on French language, basically, what's the language of the land? The lingua franca. How do most people speak? Here in the American South, lingua franca, English. But also the term pidgin used with language, kind of a derogatory term. But basically what it refers to is how people kind of borrow words from different languages and how they kind of mix languages together when they're trying to speak it. You especially see that with people trying to speak a second language. They don't have quite mastered the second language, but they know enough of the first language, what they want to say. They're trying to use the words they know to try to communicate with someone who speaks that second language. Is it something you do have to understand, of course, always understand about languages. When you see adults out and about, they know how to speak. They know how to use their languages. If someone is struggling to speak English, say, or another language, I don't feel bad. It means they already know another language. They're trying to speak in a second language, or maybe even a third. It also brings the expression polyglot. Polyglot is someone who can speak multiple languages, 3, 4, 5 languages. Sometimes it's because they have to, because of their job or trade or diplomacy or something like that, military. or sometimes it's because they're really good at languages. And if you end up speaking more than one language, generally what it does, it helps you be able to read and write better in your native language, but also helps you pick up other languages because you can see the relationships between words and sentence structure. For example, you can pick up English and then start speaking German. Picking up another Germanic language would be fairly easy, like Danish or Norwegian or something like that. You learn it fairly quickly because you already recognize the pattern. So, language, very important tool for how we express ourselves, communicating ideas, and also hopes and dreams. It's like Stephen Hawking once made the comment that language was a critical development because it allowed us to unleash the power of our imagination. It wasn't just locked into our minds, but we could now say it was on our mind to the whole world. And that's that.